things don't always work out great, and you have trials and tribulations. And I never really learned how to handle those things. I never really learned how to handle stress. Honestly, I was very stressed about my future and about where I was going in life. And I could never really put things into perspective long enough to understand the value of patience. And so I just felt super lost and inferior growing up. And like I said, it just progressed as I got older, as things became heavier for me. And I never told a soul about it. I never uttered one word that I was feeling these things. I never even thought that I was depressed, because my exposure to mental health and what it really looked like was so minimal and so low that I never really thought anything of it.
Hey, welcome back to Normalize a Conversation. Today I'm here with Emma Benoit, suicide attempt survivor, sharing her story to spread hope. Emma, you are absolutely amazing. I am so excited to have you on today. How are you really?
I'm doing great. It's so amazing to be able to be a part of this podcast and have this conversation.
I am, first of all, amazed by you. I met you at the screening of your documentary, My Ascension, and I'd really like to walk through your mental health journey and talk about your story and how it led to you wanting to share your story.
Yeah, so I'll just go back to the beginning. So growing up, I was super fun, charismatic, loved to dance, loved to perform. I was always putting on shows for my family and was really just a very exuberant kid. I loved life. I was very ambitious and outgoing. And then when I got to elementary school, I really started to struggle with insecurity and self-image issues. And that carried on pretty much up until I attempted. It just continued to get worse and things became heavier on me. But I never let anyone know that what they did or said hurt me, because I never wanted to be perceived as weak. I was always trying to protect this image of myself, so that others didn't think that anything was wrong. And I wanted to be this strong, perfect person that I thought everyone expected me to be. And so I was dealing with a lot of insecurity, a lot of self-deprecation, a lot of negative self-talk. And then naturally, with life, things don't always work out great, and you have trials and tribulations. And I never really learned how to handle those things. I never really learned how to handle stress. Honestly, I was very stressed about my future and about where I was going in life. And I could never really put things into perspective long enough to understand the value of patience. And so I just felt super lost and inferior growing up. And like I said, it just progressed as I got older, as things became heavier for me. And I never told a soul about it. I never uttered one word that I was feeling these things. I never even thought that I was depressed, because my exposure to mental health and what it really looked like was so minimal and so low that I never really thought anything of it. I thought that I was just crazy, that my brain doesn't work like other people's brains work. I don't know how to process emotions. Things just really sit on me for way too long. And I never really identified with my mental illness that I do have. And so, like I said, for me, experiencing all those things, yet never talking about it, never being open with anyone with it, really led me to being in a really dark place. And I was just extremely hopeless when I was in high school and a teenager. Those were some of the rougher years of my life. Looking back, you wouldn't have thought that, though, because like I said, this image I was just trying to protect and really just portray this image for people, to kind of protect myself in a way. And ultimately, it was the worst thing that I could have done. I thought that by being silent, that it would all go away, or that I would be able to handle it on my own, which is just not the case at all. And so ultimately, when I was 16, it was the summer before my senior year of high school, I attempted suicide. And I think what's the most compelling fact for me personally about my own attempt is that I was experiencing what I know now to be suicidal ideation for years. My thoughts were manifesting in ways like, if I just drove off the side of the bridge, it would be easy, it'd be done, or I wish I was never born, or life would just be so much easier if I didn't have to deal with all of this. So those were the thoughts that were perpetuating in my head for a couple of years before I actually attempted. And then I would say it was about 3 days that my thoughts went from suicidal ideation to active suicidal thoughts. And it was in the matter of those 3 days that really things changed for me. And I couldn't possibly see any other way that things could get better. And I was just really hopeless. And so ultimately, like I said, I did attempt suicide, and miraculously being able surviving that and overcoming something like that, which by man's definition typically is a fatal injury. Surviving that and seeing everything that happened and transpired in my life, I really felt a calling to talk about this and just to be open about it and to be vulnerable with people, to let them know that mental health does not have a face. First of all, it could be any one of us struggling with our mental health. And then secondly, that no one is ever alone in this, because that's something that I felt so deeply. I felt really alone. I felt like I was the only one that was experiencing these things. And so I guess just overcoming all of that and noticing the need. Some of my friends that I had been close with reached out to me and expressed some similar feelings and experiences in their own lives. And I just really realized that I'm not the only one. And if I'm not the only one, then that means there are other people out there who are in the same position that I was in. And so I just felt like a calling to share my story in that way. And it's been such a crazy journey, and I'm sure we can get into it more, but it's been wild, to say the least.
Thank you so much for being so open and vulnerable, first of all, and for being so willing to share your story. I mean, you are impacting so many people, but you brought up so many amazing points. I want to say that my childhood experience with mental health and mental illness was very similar in the sense of body image and the way people were speaking to me and not wanting to stand up for myself, not wanting to be perceived as weak, having these suicidal thoughts and not realizing that they were suicidal thoughts. Because sometimes it may have been like, I want to hurt myself or I want to kill myself, but it was more so, I don't want to be here. I'm not good enough to be here. I don't deserve to be here. I wish I wasn't born. And people don't realize that that is suicidal ideation. It's not just, I want to kill myself. There's so many more thoughts that manifest. So I'm really happy you brought that up and that you are so dedicated to sharing your story, because like you said, you're not alone in this. So many people feel so alone and like they're the only one. Who was the first person who really reached out to you and helped you realize that you weren't the only one going through this?
So I would say it was, I'm not going to name drop here, but it was a really close friend of mine who actually I hadn't really talked to all that much. Like, we were close friends, but we didn't go to the same school. And we just kind of hung out distantly, like, on the weekends occasionally and things like that. But she has, like I said, had always been a super close friend of mine. And when this happened to me, she was kind of like right back at my side again. And we really bonded and formed a closer friendship through that process. And she was the first person that was open enough to ask me questions. And so by her asking me questions, it really created an open dialogue, and it allowed her to share some similar experiences that she had that I don't even know that she's ever shared with anyone. So I think just by me, obviously I would not want anyone to have to experience what I experienced in the way that I experienced it. But I think that because I went through it and because I attempted suicide, it opened a door for her to be like, whoa, like now I can really talk to her about it. And so from that first experience of talking to a distant friend about their experiences, it really just kind of snowballed, and people really showed me that I really was never alone. And it was honestly complete strangers that were reaching out, and people that were living in my community were reaching out to me and letting me know that, I'm not alone, that they felt the same way, that they had similar experiences when they were teenagers. And so just to hear testimonies from other people that I had known in passing or seen in the store and stuff like that, it just makes it so much more real. And it really brings a new level of humanity in my perspective, in terms of understanding that everybody has these similar experiences. No one is immune to to a mental health, issue.
Exactly. Every single person has some kind of mental health story, whether it is living with a mental illness or losing someone to suicide or just struggling with feelings of anxiety or depression, having these symptoms. Mental health is really a spectrum. It's not just illness and perfectly fine. Most of us exist in the middle on any given day. And sometimes we are way at one end of the scale and sometimes we're way at the other. But by having normal conversations, like you said, having your friend reach out and ask questions, to talk about it, to have a normal conversation, that is how we learn that other people are struggling and that we're not the only ones and there are things we can do about it. But how long did it take from their suicide attempt to having that first conversation and realizing you weren't alone?
So it took me, honestly, a lot longer than I would have hoped. I would say that because my injuries were so critical, I really spent the first half of my recovery focusing on that. I focused really heavily on my physical recovery and regaining my strength and regaining my abilities. And so it wasn't until I had come home from the hospital that I really realized everything that had happened. And because I was brought back to the place where it happened, I attempted in my parents' home. And so being brought back home, it was like all of the emotions came rushing back. And I remembered more things than I was able to remember when I was in the hospital, because I think that my brain was trying to protect me in some way so that I could heal, because it was really hard to remember all the details and what led up to that. And actually the act of it, I could not remember, the act of it. But when I got home, like I said, being back in the environment where it happened, I really was reminded of everything that transpired. And that's when I decided to be open about this and to share my story. And I decided to start blogging because at the time that was really the only way that I felt I got anything out of processing things. So I was seeing a therapist and working with a counselor, obviously, after I attempted and things like that. But I still wasn't to the place where I was allowing myself to be fully truthful, because I was still so used to being on the defense and protecting myself, and saying things that I knew other people would want to hear. I was still very much in the people pleasing mentality. And so blogging and writing my feelings and things down really was the outlet that I turned to that really kickstarted this journey for me. And so I just started a blog and write things down, express things that I never felt I could express verbally. And I was encouraged to publish those blogs on the internet. And lo and behold, that's where a whole bunch of people started reaching out, people from my community, people that I had never met before, reaching out and just, like I said, sharing similar experiences. And it was really eye-opening to be able to learn of other people's testimonies and just to really see the parallels between my story and theirs. It was just the most, like I said, eye-opening experience. And I really attribute that experience to, I really think that by me hearing all those stories and learning of those testimonies, it gave me the courage and really empowered me to share my story in this way. So
I love that. Sometimes it does take other people's experiences and knowing that we're not alone to really empower us to want to continue the conversation. And like you said, when you're so used to being a people pleaser, to doing what you're supposed to do, what the world tells you to do, it can be really hard to change and to start speaking up and speaking out, especially when there is this giant stigma and there is a fear of judgment and you don't know how people are going to react or what they're going to say. What was that like mentally going through to publishing that first blog? Were you afraid? Were you nervous? Were you excited? What was that like?
I was so nervous. I actually sat on it. Like, I had my first blog finalized and ready to be uploaded for about, like, I would say, if I'm remembering correctly, it was well over a week. And I was just like deep in prayer about it and just like really trying to process how it would make me feel, knowing that my words and my testimony directly from me are going to be out there for really anybody to see because it's the internet. That was really challenging for me. It was something that I really wrestled with, like I said, for a lot longer than I wanted to. But I will never forget when I decided to upload it. It was right around the new year. I think it was actually New Year's Eve, if I'm not mistaken. And so I was just encouraged by some of my friends. They were like, it's now or never. If you're just do it, just send it and like put it out there and, it'll be great. And so they encouraged me and I took to their encouragement and I just went with it. But it was very difficult. It was a very difficult decision because there was still that fear. There was still that hesitation of being perceived in a negative way or people not viewing me in the same way that they once did. And I was still kind of caught up in not wanting to be perceived in a negative way, or I was still really trying to protect that image that I had worked so hard to create all those years. And there was a lot of fear, a lot of hesitation, but it was thanks to my friends and their encouragement that I just did it. And I'm so glad that I said yes.
I'm so glad that you had friends who encouraged you, because when you're doing it alone and you're going through it alone, it can be terrifying. But to have a support system, that can be so helpful. What was your support system like after the suicide attempt as you continue to go on and become this amazing suicide prevention advocate?
The support that I was met with was unlike anything like I've ever had in my life. Like, it was so incredibly overwhelming. And something that you guys would probably like to know is that my attempt was a complete shock to my community. Like, I know it really shocked my parents and my brother. They did not see anything like that coming. They really didn't understand how badly I was hurting. And so when I attempted, it was just a complete shock. And they were more so wanting me to to survive. That was their number one concern, was if I would live or die. And so in the initial days, I was met with the utmost support from not only my parents and my brother, but my entire community really just rallied around my family and really supported us in ways, like I said, that I had never seen before. And I think that support that I was met with right from the start is really what has helped me and progressed this journey for me. Because I don't think that if I was met with that support, I really don't think that I would have felt so empowered to be so truthful and vulnerable with my story. But it was definitely, in the beginning, it was, the immense amount of support. Everyone was there day in and day out, making meals for my family and things like that. But then it did kind of whittle away as, as time progressed and life happened. And so, being met with that support in the beginning and then having it kind of diminish over time, it really gave my family, my immediate family, the time to really process things in private. And that really allowed for so much needed dialogue, like within my family. And we really learned so much about ourselves and about our family dynamic and the way that we were operating things as a family unit and all those things. And we really had a chance to make some pretty big changes. And like I said, I think that the support that we had in the beginning kind of, I don't know how to put it, but kind of put like a rose-colored lens around what was to come. So it was quite the journey. But to sum it all up, the support that I had been given and was met with from the beginning was unlike any other. It still baffles me. I mean, there's photos of the waiting room in the hospital, and there were people laying on the ground just to come and visit me and just to be there for me. So it was, I'm still trying to process it, honestly, like that many people were genuinely there for me. And it really showed me how cared for I was and how loved I was,
Yeah, that is amazing to see how much support you got, but then also that your family had time to process it in private, because both pieces are essential. We do need people to show up for us and be there for us, and it can make everything feels so much better because there is this stigma. And a lot of times when it comes to suicide and suicide attempts, people back away because they're uncomfortable and they don't know how to have these conversations. So to see that people were there and showed up is amazing. But also to see that you guys had time as a family unit to have these conversations, to make these changes is another amazing piece. So looking back at that time, what was it like starting those dialogues in your family? I guess you said in the beginning that you hadn't really had much conversation and information on mental health. So what was it like learning how to have these conversations?
It was definitely a learning curve, to say the least. I mean, you know, I totally understood where my parents were coming from in the sense of they were raised in a totally different generation with totally different outlooks on mental health and what it really is. And so I never once faulted them for not understanding why I did what I did. But I think what made that process feel so like easy was the fact that my parents were just so submissive and wanting to understand. They were just like, like, we don't understand what led you to do something like that. We don't understand what could have been that bad that you didn't want to be alive anymore, but we're here to learn. We're here to hear you. And just to have that as, the like kind of like the response for this journey to begin was just, it really like set us up for success. And but I mean, those conversations, they looked like a number of different things, but some of them were easy and some of them were difficult, more challenging. But I think that the biggest piece was the overall understanding on both sides, right? Like I totally understood where they were coming from, and I never faulted them because I understood. And same with them. They never faulted me because they didn't understand. And so I think that having that groundwork really, like I said, set us up for success in that journey as a family.
Communication is so important, and being able to have these open dialogues, to listen, to not place blame. I think in today's world specifically, we're kind of taught communication by placing blame and picking a side, and that's it, and not
Mhm.
knowing how to just listen, to hear somebody and to want to learn from their perspective, because
Mhm.
there are so many things we aren't going to understand, and someone's mental health and mental illness we're never going to completely understand because we're not in their head. We're not living with it every single day. So we can listen to learn how to be supportive. We can listen to understand what they're going through and be there and show up for them and let them know that they're not alone. And I think that is something that we just don't talk about nearly enough. So for other parents who may have kids who are struggling or not know if their kid is struggling, what advice do you have about starting a dialogue?
I would definitely advise parents, just always understand that your child or your youth is in a totally different place in life than you are. Because I know, and I can only speak from my experience, right? But I know from my experience, the thing that really was a hindrance in my communication with my family was that they could not understand how things could affect me so deeply because they had totally different life experiences and they were much older than me. So by right, they had gone through much more life. They had experienced much more trial and tribulation, and they overcame it. And so for me to be a totally different person, to be an individual, aside from my mom and dad, they really had to come to an understanding of, even though she is our child, she is an individual. And she has her own set of thoughts and her own desires and her own insecurities, and we need to respect that. And so I think that is the number one thing that a parent can do for their kid, is just understand that they are a part of you, yes, but they are also individual, and that whatever they're going through is uniquely valid because it's their experience. And just avoid comparing, right? Like, relating is a great thing, like being able to relate to someone when they're expressing an experience or a feeling, but never compare, because that's something that I was met with when I would, go to speak to adults and just try to express some things, which again is no fault of their own because they were brought up in a different generation. But I think that the comparison piece and saying, well, you know, other people out there have it worse than you, be grateful for what you have, and kind of going that direction is not going to be productive at all. So I think just overall understanding that, like I said, your kid is an individual, and what they experience is valid. And also remember to put yourself back in that time in life, right? Like that perspective is huge. Like understanding that your kid's perspective is going to be different than yours because they're younger than you. They haven't lived as much life as you. And just, that overall understanding, I think, is really crucial in any dialogue, but especially parent to kid.
Yes, exactly. And going back to the comparison, I think that because parents have so much more life experience, they see that, okay, something happening right now is not the end of the world, and it's going to get better, and you're going to get through this. And there are so many more things to worry about. And yes, but also when you are 15 and your heart is broken, that's the end of the world to you, and that's okay. You're not worried about paying bills because you probably don't have bills to pay. You're not worried about putting food on the table. You're not worried about maintaining a job. You're worried about your heart and your friendship circle, because that can change what people are going to say. There's so many things happening that are your entire world. So also looking at that perspective, like you said, going back into their shoes at the age that they're at. I think as parents, just because they have so much more on their plates, they forget what it's like to be 16 and how it's not the same responsibilities, and that's okay, but it's still valid and important. And then again, with comparison, one of the biggest things that I hear a lot is parents saying, oh, well, I was bullied too and I got through it. The world has changed with technology and social media. Kids aren't just bullied at school and then have summer break and go home from school and everything's fine. It is 24/7. Yep. So understanding that the world has changed as well, and there are other factors at play, can be crucial.
Yeah, totally. And I think that to that point that you just made about, that statement that a lot of parents tend to make with their youth is, I was bullied too. I experienced that too. And I look at me, I'm fine. That's a point. Yes. But there's also the point to add to that of your parents said the same thing about you, and their parents said the same thing about them. And look at how over time this pattern is happening, right? So if we could just break that pattern and say, wow, that must be really hard that you're being bullied. How can I help and support you? Right? Like going that direction versus the comparing and saying, oh, I'm fine. I was bullied and I'm fine, because it's like they have to think that, well, their parents said that about them, and, so it's all about breaking those patterns, I think.
I completely agree. One thing people say to me all the time, and I heard this from someone else, I didn't come up with it, but if kids are so resilient, why are so many adults in therapy? We assume that kids are so resilient and they're going to get through everything, and that if something traumatic happens or they lose someone, they're going to be okay. They're going to get through it. And we forget to check in with them. We forget to acknowledge their feelings. Even if we don't know how to support them and we need to get them outside help, we still have to acknowledge and validate their feelings. Because if we don't, they do just stuff it in, because like you said earlier, you didn't want to be perceived as weak. Because when you're crying and you're a child, they tell you to build a bridge and get over it. They tell you stop acting like a baby. Big girls don't cry. You're acting like a girl. They tell us all these things that teach us to suppress our emotions. So we suppress them, and they're not acknowledged. They're not validated. And it just builds up over time.
Totally. I mean, everything that you said, I have been told. And that definitely added to my thought process of, well, these things are bad. These feelings are bad, right? And so I never wanted to express my bad feelings, but that's not true at all. Feelings aren't bad. There's no such thing as feelings are just feelings. Like that's just what it is. And so I stand right with you in that experience of the adults in my life definitely kind of, hindered me from being vulnerable with my emotions because it was seen in a negative light. because every time that, someone cries, you hear what? Stop crying. Oh, don't cry. Right. Or, don't be so sensitive. That was one that was said to me kind of a lot. And so, I think that hearing those things growing up just added to everything that I was experiencing and only compounded it all within me.
Exactly. And I think that as we get older, the more we hear it, the more it just is in the back of our minds, telling us all the reasons why we're not good enough. Because we're having these feelings, we're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We're not good enough. We don't belong. And that fuels suicidal ideation, whether or not we realize it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that's so common that almost everyone experiences in their lifetime, whether or not they realize it. And it's so hard to advocate for yourself when you don't even know what to advocate for because it's in the back of your mind. It's
Mm-hmm.
all these statements over and over again, like a broken record, without you even realizing it. And it's just ingrained in you not to speak up. So, how do
Mm-hmm.
you know what to advocate for if you don't know how to identify these feelings and what they mean and where they're coming from?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, looking back to my own experience, that stands very true because I was totally experiencing depression. I had been depressed for years, honestly, and I was totally experiencing social anxiety and crippling anxiety, honestly. But I never would have put the word to my own experience because, like I said, the exposure and the knowledge of these things was so minimal. And on the flip side of that, anytime something would come up, it would be, like you said, shut down with those phrases. And eventually they did get ingrained into my head. And I did start to believe them as fact. And I took those words as vow. And so having your own emotional distressors and stressors of life and dealing with everything like that, and then you automatically spit out one of those sayings that were just ingrained into your head and you just quiet yourself, you tuck yourself away. And I was totally in that habit, and I really made it a point to put out this exterior image that seemed untouchable. And anytime someone would try to pry at me or ask me questions, I would just immediately become defensive. And looking back, that was a symptom of my depression. Easy anger, low tolerance for frustration, things like that. But no one would have ever known because, like you said, no one talks about these things. No one really wants to talk about these things because it's scary or it's taboo. But I feel like with what I'm trying to do with sharing my story, my experience, chipping away at that wall slowly but surely. So I have high hopes for the future and the future generations. But yeah, it was totally ingrained in my head. And I really believed those things to be true. I really thought that I was a bad person for feeling bad things. I thought that I was so ungrateful for not always being grateful. I really thought that, shame on me for not seeing how great my life is. I was always in that state of thinking and always in that state of comparison, which was really toxic for my mental health. And looking back, like I said, I was unaware that that type of thinking was contributing to my feelings and the way I viewed myself and the way I viewed life in general. But it totally was. And so knowing what I know now, it just fuels this fire within me to let people know that that type of thinking and that type of mentality is harmful and is damaging.
It is so true. And like you said about gratitude and feeling guilty for not feeling grateful all the time, one thing we always kind of joke about is that, oh, you have first world problems. Your
Mm-hmm.
problems really aren't that bad.
Mm-hmm.
You should be grateful for all that you have. And yes, you should be grateful. I agree. I get that. But there's a difference between being grateful and feeling sad, and they can coexist.
Mm-hmm.
You can struggle and still be grateful. You can have thoughts of suicide and still be grateful. They are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is something that we just don't talk about enough.
Yeah, totally. I agree to that statement. And, growing up, that's something that I was kind of confused about. I thought that, why do I feel this way? Like, look at all that I have. Like, I was so down and out about myself because I felt this way. And it really is a toxin to have that thought exist in your head, because it's just not true at all. Because there is a difference between being grateful and feeling grateful, right? Like, innately, I was always grateful. I never once looked past the things that I had in life. I was always grateful. But there's a difference between being grateful and feeling grateful, like, and that's something that I was trying to always maintain. I always wanted to let people know that I'm grateful and I'm appreciative, because I always was. But at the same time, by me always trying to let people know that I am grateful and I'm appreciative, it was in a way hindering me from being honest with myself and saying, no, I am grateful, but I'm also sad. And I'm also hurting, and I'm also confused and lost and feel like I don't have an identity, so that's absolutely right, that they totally can coexist. And, those feelings of gratitude can be helpful in a mental health journey, as they have been for me, but they are not everything. You can't look to a person's circumstances in life and automatically assume that if they struggle, they'll be fine because look at their life, and that's something that I dealt with, was the stereotyping. I was looking back very stereotyped because I was a blonde cheerleader on varsity squad. I was popular. I had a great group of friends. My parents were happily married. I just gotten a new car for my 16th birthday. Like, everyone was like, not Emma. Like, what does she have to be depressed about? What does she have to be sad about? So I was stereotyped in that way. And that too hindered me from being vulnerable and honest about how I was feeling, because there was that image that people had of me that was just like not to ever touch anything related to their mental health. And so I think it's just a matter of, number one, talking about these things as we are right now, but also breaking down those barriers and breaking down those stigmas and stereotypes, because until we understand collectively as a society that every individual has the right and the space to suffer mentally and emotionally, I don't think we're going to see big changes happening.
I completely agree. There's stereotyping specifically. People always say, oh, you don't look like you have a mental illness. You don't look like you're someone who would struggle. And they've attached some kind of image to every single mental health disorder. And a lot of it comes from the media. Mm-hmm. To be completely honest, a lot of it comes from what we see on TV. Someone living with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or a borderline personality disorder is most likely to be a serial killer or murderer or something. Mm-hmm. Someone who is struggling with depression has to be someone who is completely falling apart and doesn't have anything. Someone with anxiety is usually a high school girl. Mm-hmm. The same with the eating disorders. Mm-hmm. They have that same image, and that's what we expect. And that's it. So when someone else is struggling, it doesn't make sense why. Mm-hmm. They're being dramatic. Mm-hmm. They're faking it. They want attention. Of course, we think that way because society is telling us that that's not possible for them. That's not true, without even realizing that they're giving us those messages.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that's very accurate in terms of our exposure to what mental health really looks like is straight from the media and straight from television and what we're fed as citizens. And so I think that, it is very damaging that is kind of the image that's portrayed in terms of all these mental illnesses. And I mean, your descriptions are pretty spot on. I mean, the schizophrenia, bipolar is typically portrayed as serial killers or people that break the law. But that's, again, all of that is completely false and needs to be rewritten 100%, because like I said, until we all collectively understand that every individual has the space and the place to suffer mentally and emotionally, then we won't really break barriers. And it is really triggering, to say the least, to see that mental illness is depicted in that way in the media, because it just continues to feed that narrative. and continues to add to the notion that mental illness is only a select amount of people and they look a certain way and you know how to spot them. And, looking back, I kind of fell victim to that belief as well in high school. And that maybe is even why I never really identified that that's what I was experiencing, because I believed in that stigma and that stereotype belief that there's no way that I'm depressed because look at my life. I don't look like a depressed person. The person that sits alone every day and wears just black to school is depressed. That's what I thought. And it absolutely had a negative effect on my own mental health journey because that's what I believed to be the case. And so knowing, or I guess believing in those stereotypes and stigmas added to the hindrance of me speaking up and sharing how I was feeling. So overall, it's just really harmful and damaging. And I think collectively, both you and I are trying to chip away at it and kind of rewrite the narrative for what mental health is and what it looks like.
Yes, we are. And it is so needed. There's not enough conversations, and we are finally able to start having these conversations. Years ago, they would never allow conversation like this in a school because there was this idea that if you were talking about mental health, you were talking about suicide, kids were more likely to attempt. And that's not true. And we're finally getting to a place where we can have these conversations and people are ready to listen. So when you go and have these conversations, what are they like? What do you talk about?
A number of things, but mostly, honestly, what we've been talking about, the stigma and the stereotypes and the overall idea that a person who's struggling with their mental health is ungrateful or not seeing things clearly or has a warped perception of life. We talk about all of those things, and it's really been super eye-opening yet again for me to be able to hear the testimonies of the youth. That's kind of my target audience with the documentary film that I've had the chance to work on, that encompasses my story, is really sharing it with high schoolers and middle schoolers and really getting that message in front of them. And the number one thing that they always tell me is how relieved they are to hear someone's story that looks like me. Because, you just don't hear it. You just don't see it on the mainstream media or in front of you. And so that's the number one thing that they always tell me, is that they're relieved to see my story because they have similar experiences and they're, in a similar place in life that I was. And so overall, the best thing about, or one of the better things about the events and me getting to share my story in the way that I do, has been the response and just the overall community that it has made. And there's really been a sense of community in this field and in this work, essentially, that I've gotten to do. And it's just been so humbling and eye-opening for me to be able to feel such a sense of community and something that I felt like had isolated me for so long.
You are absolutely amazing. Having these conversations is so important, especially when it comes from someone you can identify with. When it comes from someone who you wouldn't expect to be struggling, because it really does normalize it. It really does wipe away that stigma that it has to look a certain way, that it has to be a certain way. It helps people realize that it's okay to be struggling and it's okay to identify a mental health disorder or mental illness and understand that's something you're struggling with, but that's not your identity. And you can be so many different things, and you can have hope. That your story is the definition of hope. Everything that you've gone through and everything that you've become and been able to do inspires people, especially people who are struggling, to know that it can get better. People tell us all the time, it'll get better, it'll get better. And you're like, how do you know? Like, genuinely, how do you know? Yeah. But to see your story, it really is evidence that it can get better. Emma, I want to thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing and for joining me today. How can people connect with you and learn more about you?
So they can connect with me. I have several ways of connection. But the number one thing is social media. We are on Instagram and Facebook. The account is My Ascension Movie on Instagram. And then our website is myascension.us. And my blogs are actually still up if you guys are interested in reading those. The website is liferejuvenated.org. And then I'm just on Instagram, social media. Follow me if you want, or don't, that's fine too. But yeah, that's really kind of the main ways to kind of get in touch with us and follow along with what we're doing. I really advise that you guys follow the Facebook page, just My Ascension, because I kind of work through there. I have I don't know what it's called, a Facebook group that I like to post on and interact with people. So that's definitely a good way for people to interact and be a part of it and get involved. So
Emma, you are amazing. Thank you again so much for everything that you're doing and for having this conversation with me.
no, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and the platform to share with your audience. And I just want to second that. You are amazing equally as well. And what you're doing and what you're working on is just incredible. And I fully support inspiring my generation and everything that you have in the works. So we're in it together though.